I'm here today with a very special guest, farmer and author John Klar, who's getting set up on his side right at this moment. And I think he might have a little friend to introduce us to. Yeah, he's just published a book called Small Farm Republic, which we're going to talk about today. An exciting, interesting book that I've had a chance to preview really quickly over the past 12 hours or so. So anyway, do you have a friend you want to introduce us to on your side?
I do. My wife Jackie's bringing him into us. We have a little young lamb who likes to do interviews with me.
Great. Yeah, yeah. You have your interview security lamb. I like that. But you could get him through. You get him through an airport. He's like an emotional support lamb.
He's like a blanket.
Everybody should have one of those. I mean, I completely agree.
A blanket you have to feed. Oh my. Oh, he's a little. He's okay. He is.
Here you go.
Oh,
He's a Dorset. You mentioned you raise sheep.
we do.
Now, should we change our view so that
There he
he
is.
can be the center of attention for your?
Right.
So he has no name, but as you see, he's completely video docile. Yeah, he was just kind of a runt, so in a triplet, so we supplemented him with an old beer bottle with some milk in it, and so of course once they learn that you're harmless, they're not afraid of you anymore.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of sheep do you raise, Josh?
Right now we have a mix of Shetland and Jacobs.
Yeah, Jacob's four horns are beautiful.
Yeah, so that's kind of part of how we've sort of started our flock. Um, my wife is a veterinarian, and her boss, who owns the clinic, also raises sheep and lots of different animals. And her boss loves the Jacobs. She like raises them for show animals, right? For
Oh yeah,
pretty horns, and they look really cool and all this. And so that's like her focus. And so our flock starter has been the non-show quality, whatever, Jacobs and some Shetlands and stuff like that. And we kind of like the Shetlands and have kind of more veered towards them, but then we also get her Jacobs kind of cast offs and stuff like that. So it's a little bit of a mix, and we're also thinking about starting to branch into some Katahdins, I guess. So ours are like dual purpose wool and meat, and it would be nice. We shear and stuff, which is, as I'm sure you're aware, it's a ton of work. It's hard work. Um, so I'm kind of talking about ourselves, but just to give a background real quick, we've just been in this now for about 3 years, and this season right now, since late April, is our first retail foray into selling at the farmers market, selling our lamb and pasture raised pork. And so part of it is an experiment to see what the market is like, and are we going to be sitting on a bunch of inventory, not able to sell it, or are we going to be selling out faster than we can keep up, or like really like kind of exploring that space. And so right now we have about 20 sheep, and we've had good sales so far, and I would be comfortable with like doubling our flock size next year and kind of trying to grow incrementally based on the experience and stuff that we've had so far. So we're really just getting our feet into it now. But you guys have been in operation now for a while, and that was kind of the starting point. I definitely we'll get to your book and we'll delve into that, but just by way of introduction, I mean, you're a farmer and an author, you're a lawyer, so you have like real heterogeneous background and experience. But definitely the listeners would be interested to hear a little bit of your background, how you ended up where you are in Vermont, and especially give us a picture of your operation now, like what your farm is like now, what animals you have, what it looks like, and try to paint us as much of a picture of your sort of day-to-day life as a farmer as you can. And then we'll kind of delve into some of your writings.
All right, Josh. Thank you. That's a lot of stuff you just threw at me, but I'm a lawyer. I can handle it, and I'm a farmer, so I can handle it. I actually was putting you off a little bit there, asking about you, and I was smiling, but I was actually, because I'm actually very interested in what you're doing, because I wrote this book for people like you. My job at almost 60 is to try to part the waters, so to speak, to allow more young people to farm, to reclaim the traditions that we're losing, as Chris Smaje talks about. You mentioned that, Urema. We'll talk about Chris. I may have different political views than some people, let's say, on transgender hormones for 12-year-olds, but when it comes to fresh local foods, conservatives and liberals need to get together. In fact, that's part of my transition too. I was an attorney for a number of years. I was actually a tax attorney, and that was my focus of study in law school, which is very interesting when you're starting to look at the Farm Bill. Very interesting when you're looking at regulations for slaughter rules, which immediately I wanted to ask you about how you're getting your animals to market, but we'll set that aside. But your experience and what you're doing, my book is designed to encourage more people to do what you're doing and to help make it possible for you to do so without corporate interests that don't want you to succeed stopping you. Joel Salatin indicates in his books that there's about a 5-year learning curve for you. So you're already well on your way. It depends on what you're learning in farming. Farrowing pigs is a lot more challenging than, raising radishes or chickens. We're headed towards a food crisis. So my background is in tax, also in finance. I'm a big student of money supply, and I've been writing and talking about inflation for years, including I accurately and strongly predicted the 07-08 fiscal collapse. And nobody wanted to listen. Nobody wanted to listen. All the experts, all the bankers, and all the so-called know-it-alls didn't see it coming. So if you're not going against the stream, you may be a dead fish, as C.S. Lewis once said. So with my background in law, I had no intention of farming, though my family is background here in Vermont, farmers for many generations, and I grew up around dairy farms. And that's one reason I didn't want to do it. They're all poor, they were healthy enough, and many of them milked into their 80s. But we were told in our family when we were young, get out of Vermont, get out of farming, you'll never make a living. And so off I went to law school. Graduated near the top of my class law school. I then, after returning from the UK, where I was a tax practitioner, I opened my own practice in Connecticut and practiced for about 8 years as a litigator. And then I got sick with Lyme disease, but all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't seem to figure out what the problem was. And I ended up having to close everything I built. I owned my own building, I had my own practice, I was hiring lawyers. And so I decided to jump into farming, because if there was one thing that was clear, that was with this fibromyalgia syndrome that I was 34. I hadn't been to a doctor in almost 15 years for anything. And I was climbing Mount Washington in January, and you might have read my intro, and I was the epitome of health. And all of a sudden I was the exact opposite. So my wife, Jackie, and we bought a 160-acre former dairy farm in northeastern Vermont, not knowing at all what we were doing, for $115,000 full asking price for 160 acres with 11,000 square feet of barns and a house. And some Amish people own it now. And then we only sold it because I knew the real estate market was going to collapse. But also, so we just jumped. And I really have to say that, I must humbly tell people that I'm telling people to jump out of the city, jump out of the white collar work, unless you're loving it. Some people like, what they're doing. I was very good at lawyering, but I didn't like it. I actually started out as a chemical engineer student, by the way, at Rutgers. You mentioned you're in engineering, but I didn't really like it. And so in the farming case, it was health. But so I can't claim a lot of credit for having jumped, but I can say it's the greatest thing we ever did for raising our kids, for learning about where our food came from. So it really wasn't my priority to get into farming to move towards something as much as to escape or flee something, and then just simply trying to. So I had to learn from scratch. I'd never made a bale of hay. You can make a bale of hay. If a lawyer could make a bale of hay, working class people can make. Of course, I was working class before I went to law school. But I also learned about soil, and I had to become a mechanic, and I learned about food processing, and I learned about food regulations, and I learned about food health. And I expected my chickens to not taste as good as what was purchased in the store, but the opposite was true. After you start raising your own food, it's, you've got you don't know, everything is comparative. So when what you're comparing it to is all crappy food, you don't know when you're eating all crappy food that a lot of it's crappy food. I grow chickens and lamb, and you can't get in the store what we grow. And so to complete the story, because you asked where we are now and what my day-to-day operations is, when we sold the farm, we were milking goats and sheep. I had built, the lawyer, had complied with the Vermont's pasteurized milk ordinance to construct an artisanal raw milk dairy where we milked both cows and goats and made cheeses, aged raw milk cheeses. And we sold the farm. We also at that time had over 100 sheep, about 40 pigs. We were raising Percheron draft horses, and we had about 30 cows. And so, yeah, the neighbors called me Old McDonald because I had so many animals. And so we downsized. And since then, we have been raising grass-fed beef and lamb, which is just a niche market that we found. The dairy industry has been, declining. So unless you're going to do a value-added product like cheese or what I would call a value-added product like raw milk, which is booming. And if you just, to me, it's all about selling directly to your customers. Get rid of the middlemen. They've been, even last year during the COVID crisis, the price of beef went through the roof, but the profits of the corporations who were processing them did not. Did I get that right? Also went through the roof. So consumers suffered while farmers suffered, while the middlemen make all the money. That's what they're doing for milk for 100 years. This war on farmers by a corporate government alliance has been going on since my grandfather's time, when the bulk tanks came in, and when this farm started to decline. So now we've moved to central Vermont. We're actually about to move back to our off-grid house that we built ourselves on my great grandfather's land. And we're more about subsistence and homesteading. We do have about 60 sheep right now, counting our lamb crop and this guy, and 16 cows and a bunch of chickens. And we're just getting up to scale where we're sort of determining whether to downsize or upsize. And something you and others need to be aware of, and something I discuss in the book, is food inflation is here to stay. Energy inflation is here to stay. This is partly economic, inflation and monetary policy, printing money. So the forces that have destroyed small farms have been based on technological advances coupled with the cheap energy that has made them possible. And as energy prices go up, we already see right now that food inflation in this country and around the world has far outpaced underlying inflation. It's going to continue. So when fertilizer prices have roughly tripled, they may have come down a little bit now, and fuel prices and diesel and all the inputs for farming have gone up substantially, that's going to put a negative impact on the large corporate entities that have hitherto benefited from those cheap fuels. And the more expensive fuel gets, the more competitive my local products are. I don't have to ship them 3,000 miles. I don't have to ship lamb from Australia. Right. In refrigerated systems or frozen in planes with no air, air pollution control devices. If you really want to clean up the environment, local agriculture is the way to go. But also, if you want to eat and you want to eat healthily, local agriculture is the way to go. And if you want to rebuild rural communities and cultures, and if you were young people and you want to get out of the city and have a job, you could do this now. The price of lamb when we started doing this 25 years ago was $2.40 a pound hanging. We were doing Corriedales, which were a dual purpose meat and wool. And there's no real market for wool. But now I've got a waiting list for $8, $9, $10 a pound, because haven't decided yet what to charge, but that's what people are charging for the same lamb. And because consumers are becoming aware of the quality of grass-fed meats, they also want to know how the animal was treated, and they realize it's better, and they're supporting their local economy. So take that and apply across.
I just want to ask you real quick, when you're talking about, so you got people lining up $8, $9, $10 a pound for lamb, and you're talking about retail cuts?
No, I'm talking about hanging weight.
Hanging weight, right on. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, thanks for clarifying. And so retail cuts versus wholes and halves and all that. That's It's actually how I got involved in this. Some years into this, I discovered a fellow named Wendell Berry. And Wendell Berry became sort of my savior, because I was learning as I went along all of these problems with the food supply and all these upside down things. And I thought I was losing it. I must be nuts. Why doesn't anybody else see this? And then I found Wendell, and I happened actually across, my first book was The Unsettling of America. Yeah. And so the more I learned about it, the more so then the state of Vermont showed up at my farm one day without announcing themselves to tell me I couldn't sell halves of beef anymore, which would instantly put the processors and slaughterers out of business, because nobody buys a full beef. So long story short, it's in the book. I decided to fight the state and use my law degree coupled with my farming knowledge to engage in good old civil disobedience, which, they'll put you in jail for that. So I don't recommend you do this at home. I think you should leave it to lawyers. And that's how I got involved, because I was pretty shocked. And that's when I read Dave Gumpert's book, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Food Rights. And it's time for Americans to start making that back to the land movement, because we left the land at our peril. And we are in deep peril right now. Our food supply, aside from quality, aside from cost, is in peril because it's become more globalized, more distant. And we live farther and farther away from our food supplies. And the San Joaquin Valley is vulnerable to drought, but also flood. We're getting more food from Brazil and China. We have supply container ships. We have trucks that are dependent on diesel exhaust fluid to bring it to us. It's all vulnerable. One little blip could destroy it all, and we could all be starving in this land of plenty.
So you mentioned the San Joaquin Valley, and I thought this is kind of where. So I was glancing through your book, glancing through the different sections. I want to say that, and we can continue to talk about, like who this book is intended for. And what I'll say from my just quick initial first glance, I'm like, this is a good primer on a lot of the important major topics that relate to food and the food economy and making a case for a transition to this small farm regenerative farming lifestyle. I wanted to start just as a way to kind of anchor the conversation. You have a chapter that goes into the water crisis and aspect, and obviously the input of water to farming and the effects of farming on pollution and that sort of thing. And one of the things that you highlight is that so much of our food is grown in a few small areas, whether it's based on the Ogallala aquifer in the Midwest or in the California Central Valley or in the Imperial Valley. So you have these highly concentrated areas where like a lot of food crops are produced, and a lot of this stuff is feed that's grown industrially to feed animals in CAFOs, or wheat or corn or alfalfa and other things that are exported. I was reminded of the Earl Butts comment about food as a weapon and how. So a lot of my work is in international sustainable development, and so I'm very tuned into how U.S. foreign policy, U.S. economic policy, U.S. ag policy affects other countries around the world. And so there's this unsustainable dependence on the water resources, unsustainable effects on the water resources, unsustainable uses of the food that's produced using these kind of things. So, I mean, people can dive into your book for a lot of details and anecdotes about the different facets of this. But the impression that I came away with is, I mean, it's easy to take water as the central focus. You could take energy or any other thing else as a focus, but I'm a water person, so I like to focus on water. And what it looks like is, I mean, these are systems that are clearly unsustainable. They can't go on forever. They're not going to go on forever, right? And so, and you highlight Chris Smaje a lot in your book, and he talks about a big resorting of the population. So we have the population distributed across the landscape in areas where the economy is failing for various reasons, including the food economy. And so we're going to be looking at probably in the coming years a big reshifting, resorting of the population. And this is something in your book and as well in some other writings. You have a great Substack where you have listings of a lot of your pieces on Substack and things you've written elsewhere. You talk a lot about like sort of social and cultural conflicts, about newcomers to rural areas. This will be something that I think that a lot of the listeners of this podcast will be interested in. There are a lot of people in this sort of broader doomer optimism community that are in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and that sort of area of New England. And a lot of issues that come up are like kind of conflicts between new people coming in, settling an area, interacting with or having clashes with the local old stock population that have been there, and that sort of cultural clash that can happen. And so, the way you tackle water issues, these are pretty location specific. I mean, there's the whole dependence on the Ogallala aquifer, there's the Central Valley, California, but in Vermont or where I am in northwestern North Carolina, lack of water is not going to be our problem. We have other problems, but lack of water is not going to be our problem. We have great water resources, right? But we're going to be probably receiving an influx of, and we already are in many ways receiving an influx of outsider populations from California and from elsewhere that are like, having trouble integrating with the locals, and that seems to be like a topic that you've commented on a lot. And I was just wondering if you could talk about how we navigate this, because I mean, the way that I was describing your book to other people that manage the DO podcast was, I was like, well, my first impression is like, this guy is like an American conservative version of Chris Smaje, and that will kind of, to say. And so I think that your book does a really good job in speaking to people who consider themselves on the conservative side of things, why they should be interested in this topics and what are some of the major issues, right? But we're famous in the US for our culture war and our sort of red, blue tribalism and all this kind of stuff. So the question is, in regions like ours, where, you could say, okay, well, the Central Valley, California, in a lot of ways, maybe is going to depopulate just because that ecosystem is not going to support the populations that have been there and the economics of the agri system there. our areas are going to be receiving and already are receiving influx of these population of outsiders. So how do we navigate that? How do we integrate people in what's going on here and kind of channel everything into this sort of regenerative farming economy that can be more durable going forward?
Boy, let's unpack that. There's a lot there. First and foremost, yes, I'm speaking as a conservative. I'm a walk away. I was a lifelong liberal. It shouldn't matter, except that the Democrats are not the Democrats that I used to be part of. And many of my views are still actually the free speech and other views that I had when I was a blue dog, moderate Democrat. And we need to find a center of people who understand the true threats facing this country, which are not the constant Orwellian fear mongering that we're pummeled with about, white supremacists and gun violence. Not that those don't exist, but food is going to be the number one issue. Now, water is connected with it. There are many different ways our food supply could be punctured or hurt. And you've mentioned water, and it's great that you have that resource. That water resource of the Ogallala aquifers is as much mine in Vermont as it is everywhere else. We have to not being so tribal that, and I know you weren't being, but let us remember that I call it, some people will talk about, well, China's polluting, that's not our problem. If China's polluting, it has a way of disseminating or distributing its way around the atmosphere. That's how the earth works. So it's like, I call it, it's farting in the bathtub. It doesn't matter if you're the other side of the bathtub, it's going to get you. Sorry to be a little simplistic, but the water crisis out west does impact us here. If it hits us, those aquifers feed this whole nation. It's actually a shockingly amazing amount of food that comes out of Nevada, Arizona, and California, and out of those aquifers. A lot of it's being diverted now for crops like almonds to make almond milk in the name of avoiding cows. It uses much more water than cows. And when cows are maligned, it is confinement operations that are maligned. So I'm actually coming around to answering your question, which is that we have a collective interest. We have a similar parallel with urban people versus country people. A lot of urban people feel, well, it isn't my problem. I can't, or I can't do anything about it. So cognitive dissonance clicks in. And a lot of people are that way with labeling. Well, I can't tell what's in my food, so they just eat everything. It's almost impossible to be a purist in these areas. So we really need to have people that are urbanites invited to the table to support their farmers around them, just like Rome fell when it collapsed from the inside or from the outside. When it lost its agrarian outlying area, started to collapse, it lost its food. We are all in peril together. So the water crisis is an easy way to attract conservatives to look at food issues they might not look at. The way agriculture has been presented, and this is very interesting what you've hit on in a way you may not have, and your listeners, I hope, will be interested by. In the area of farming, conservatives have been put on hold because of the big battle over climate and carbon. They're not, if you say, well, farming is a problem because it uses a lot of carbon, and it's, well, that's true. The question is the carbon that impactful, or is it actually making plants grow better? Some would argue. Jordan Peterson says. But if we say, well, but farming is causing a drawdown of valuable, precious water resources, without which, and they're not replenishing themselves. Farming is depleting soil at the rate of 4 or 5 tons per acre of corn, times 92 million acres of corn last year, per year, all right? And artificial or synthetic fertilizers are not repairing soils, they're destroying them. Glyphosate is not improving soils, it's destroying them. You lose soils, guess what else you lose? Water. I mean, we can see it. Healthy soils retain much, much more water. They don't require as much irrigation. Last year when we had the drought at Lake Mead, you may have recalled, Lake Mead was, everybody's looking until we had a big influx of water. Water was being diverted away from agriculture and prioritized to be used for people's toilets and lawns. So in our culture, do we value agriculture highly enough? I don't think we do.
Yeah.
And what is agriculture? So when we get back to the conservatives, well, how do I tell conservatives that they should care when they're so alienated by this carbon stuff? Meanwhile, the far left has gone off the rails with AOC and the Green New Deal, which Wendell Berry does not approve of. If you read The Art of Loading Brush, and I've talked to him about it, he's very upset about it. The Green New Deal doesn't do anything to help farmers. The whole Green New Deal is a social ideological wealth redistribution. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's just stunning what's not in there. And so the Green New Deal and the whole big push for the environment now is apparently about solar panels and EV cars as if, and many of which are very environmentally destructive and produced in China. All right. Well, what are they going to do for the soil? What are they going to do for the water? If conservatives can be drawn to look at the issues that they do agree are a problem, the toxins in their food, the dropping sperm counts in their children and grandchildren, the obesity epidemic, the diabetes epidemic, a lot of other problems, then they'll come to the table with Democrats who are not running off to ban all cows with the far left narrative now that we have to get rid of all cows, which, by the way, is a huge slur against our cows, because they're using the consequences of enslaving cows in confinement facilities to want to get rid of cows. Whereas if we put cows back out on the pastures, we would sequester more carbon, according to Joel Salatin and others, depending on how many, in just a few years than we release in the entire industrial revolution. We really are. And if you're a conservative, though, you say, well, I don't care. Well, you should care, because you'll still help restore soils, improve the microbiome, improve the health of the food, help you restore local communities. There are lots of benefits to carbon in soil, and it'll reduce the amount of chemicals in pollution in the environment. So this actually book it arose out of a conversation with Joel Salatin, who you may know is a farmer in Virginia. And he said, how do we get more conservatives to understand the importance of regenerative agriculture? How do we get them to stop eating at Chick-fil-A and killing themselves? That's what this book is. But everybody's welcome to this table. And something else I'll point out about water. If you read the Republican national GOP platform on the environment, okay, if you want to be a conservative and you don't have an environmental issue, you might as well just pack it in, because it counts. And economics counts too, but you don't have to give up one for the other. In fact, just the opposite. Economically, we're destroying ourselves with industrial agriculture, because the long-term costs of cleanup are astounding liabilities that we externalize or discount and don't look at it, just like PBAs and PFAs and all the other consequences. The economic benefits of regenerative agriculture are huge and paramount and visible. So if we turn this around, we can bring Republicans to the table, and we can bring people together. And that's what this book is about. And it doesn't need to be about carbon. We all agreed before Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth that chemicals are bad. And then we made it all about CO2. And now it's as if nobody cares about the chemicals anymore that are actually killing us.
Well, this is
sorry to finish this thought, Josh. Is this okay? The Republican platform, its environmental policy is abysmal. It hasn't been updated in years. And it talks about preserving the proprietary rights of outfits like the fracking industry, so that we don't know what's in the water that they draw out of the ground, used for fracking, are a great technological improvement. And then they pump the water back into wells, back into the ground, including over 50,000 wells in California alone. And then that water is pumped back out and sprayed on our food. Be nice to know what's in it. Are we valuing energy production at the expense of healthy food for our children? And need we do so? So I'm advocating strongly in this book for reducing monoculture subsidies and revising the Republican platform to not be a burn, baby, burn platform. Why will Americans be drawn to what otherwise might be some good conservative ideas about fiscal integrity and or social issues, when we have no viability and no relevance on the environment? And farming is the way to do that without having to jump on the renewable bandwagon. And farming is the way that we all agree we can probably do the most quickly. So thank you for allowing
you make a point there that often comes up in the doomer optimism circles, a kind of common complaint, which is, like, you highlighted the focus on carbon, CO2, and climate. And as an environmental chemist and engineer, this is my gripe too. It's the reducing of all environmental and ecological issues to essentially one metric or one term. I feel like subjectively, we hardly talk about the environment anymore. Like, if we talk about it, it's just climate, right? It's like this one thing, it's climate. And then the Green New Deal, the technocrat approach to climate, seems to be, get rid of cows and get rid of farming and formulate lab grown meat in vats and electrify everything and put up solar panels everywhere and drive electric cars. And, as an environmental engineer, I analyze all this stuff quantitatively, and I'm like, yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's not going to work, which we can demonstrate, but it's the allure of the technological solution. right?
Yes.
And so I think one of the headwinds to this sort of vision that both you and I are, trying to advocate and bring into being is the attitude that, smaller scale farming and local economics and this kind of thing, it's sort of seen as backwards, poor, low status. It's not the fancy, shiny, high tech George Jetson's future, right? The aesthetics are quite different than that. So, I, the sort of Republican Democrat or liberal conservative framework is sort of one way to break things down. But to me, it almost seems like, for me, more useful is sort of like the establishment versus everybody else, or the technocratic vision, which, I mean, the technocratic vision is absolutely hegemonic now. It's totally won for now, and it's like, I don't really see Democrats and Republicans so much as I see a uniparty
Mm-hmm.
that has pretty much taken off and lost touch with the reality and the day-to-day lives of most people and the real issues on the ground and that sort of thing. So another factor that we talk about, and when you're highlighting, okay, well, there's a Green New Deal, which is supposedly to deal with our environment and climate problems, but it's problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. My view is that whenever centralized technocratic authority recognizes something as, it's like, this is a crisis, the net result of the centralized authority recognizing a crisis seems to be empirically further concentration of wealth and political power upward, and the crisis itself not getting solved. And I go back and I look through like this century so far, and we look at 9/11, which indicated there was a crisis of terrorism. And what was the response? The Patriot Act, Guantanamo, CIA torture programs, drone assassination programs, the military industrial complex becoming so much richer, our civil liberties being eroded. And of course, none of this did anything to solve terrorism, but it just killed millions of innocent people, cost trillions of dollars, and made the situation worse. The financial crisis, which you correctly diagnosed in advance, what was the response? Bail out the bankers, kick people out of their homes, further consolidate wealth and power upward. Don't re-regulate finance, insurance, and real estate to make it safer, but allow the problem to kind of continue and blow the next bubble, right? The COVID crisis, a great example. The CARES Act was the largest upward transfer of wealth in the history of money. Further concentration of wealth and power upwards in response to a crisis. The response, if anything, damaged public health and was ineffective for controlling the spread of the virus and that sort of thing. So my lesson is like, okay, when the central authority, whether it's at the time run by Democrats or Republicans, when they declare a crisis, this seems to be the effect of what happens. And so that's why a lot of us in the geosphere are advocates of more decentralized forms of political and economic power. And certainly the small farm regenerative ag vision fits in very well, kind of that Jeffersonian agrarian ideal. I'm sure Wendell Berry's on board with that. Chris Smaje is on board with that kind of thing. And so I guess, the questions that I want to talk to you about are, practically speaking, how do we make this transition? And that's the term, the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, threats, and that sort of thing. When you see revelations like the Twitter files, the disinformation complex, authoritarianism growing in an increasingly sort of paranoid technocracy that's scared about the disintegration of its power, to what extent can we be out here in the country doing our own thing, left alone to explore and develop solutions? Are we going to be harassed? Are we going to be shut down? As a lawyer, how do we protect the freedom to try to innovate ecologically sound ways of life?
As a lawyer, boy, you loaded that final question. So
my questions are always like 10 minutes long.
That's fine. No. But as a lawyer, you kind of set me up. As a lawyer, if they took away my Second Amendment right, I would fight them with a sharpened stick. All right. Even though I'm a white collar lawyer or former white collar, just as I would a blue collar farmer. The greatest revolutionary act against this totalitarianism is to become responsible for your own food supply. Either grow it yourself or get it from people you trust. Why would you keep buying the same Kool-Aid that's tainted with cyanide from the same massive Jonestown? You've hit on, if you know Jones, if I'm talking about. What you've hit upon is imperative for people to understand. There is an effort coming to take over our entire food supply. He who controls the food controls the people. And if you believe in the Second Amendment or your guns, you will give them up and your sharpened stick for a wilted piece of lettuce. If you've never known starvation before, study famine, study what it is, and our Bible tells us it's coming. Revelation, you mentioned, well, read Revelation, and the third horse of Revelation, the black horse, comes with scales, and it predicts famine and food inflation. Pretty creepy, really, when we've left the Garden of Eden that God created, because we have technomysticism, which is what Wendell calls it, that we believe in science to be salvific and solve all problems. Science and all the agricultural produce or advancements or progress, so-called, of the Great Depression, or I beg your pardon, of the Green Revolution following World War II, promised everything and had an illusion of productivity. But now we've seen with the aquifers, with the soil loss, with the chemicals, and with the treatment of animals and the hormones that permeate their systems, that there is always a cost to scientific advance. So the answer is, there is no republic without small farms. Let them fight me. They don't want me to have the liberty to eat the food that I get directly from my farmer. The farm to consumer connection is key. And to paraphrase an historian named John Lukács, they're trying to divide us over race, over wealth, over climate, over guns, over gender and women's rights, over gender orientation, over what gender you are. But the real division between humanity is those who do and those who do not perceive that there is a war going on to enslave us all. Those who do and do not perceive that there is a food crisis coming, in which there will be those who eat and those who do not. And if you don't have food, your guns will not last long. You can't eat them. You can't eat solar panels, and you can't eat renewable energy manufactured products. The solutions, you've asked me, so I'm going to give you some, because that's what the book is about. If you're going to raise a problem and you don't have a solution, then gosh, that's negative ninny. You might as well, you're just a little red hen. The solutions are to eliminate the subsidies of toxic food, of ethanol production. You mentioned it. You mentioned 9/11. 9/11, by the way, was used to transfer authority for all food production to the Department of Homeland Security. People don't believe this, just go look. The Department of Agriculture answers to the Department of Homeland Security. Cash to clunkers. When they see people waking up, then they try to do an end run and take over on us. I voted for Obama. Obama said he was going to take care of Wall Street. He did the opposite. Obama fought for Monsanto, not Bowman and other farmers. When Vermont passed a GMO labeling requirement, which I helped get passed, the federal government and Obama immediately passed federal regulation to water it down and make it completely useless to consumers. Cash to clunkers was purported to be to save the environment, but actually it was to promote more new car sales, and it actually did the opposite of what it said it would do. Big is not better. And the Green New Deal is an effort to say that only a bigger than ever government, a global one even, can solve all the individual problems that we individuals solve or cause. And then the pitch is that then you don't have to. If you get an EV car, you've somehow solved the world's problem. Well, your EV car still absorbs the world's resources. It's still going to end up in a landfill. You're still polluting, and your Ray-Bans pollute, and your golfing trips pollute, and your computers, and your flat screen TVs, and all of your cell phones, and the lawns you mow, burning 800 million gallons of gas a year in our lawnmowers that don't have pollution control technologies, that are just destroying our soils and causing global warming. Don't hear about that, do we, Josh? Oh, it's the cows. The cows are the problem. To me, I will be increasingly focusing on cows because, grass-fed, rotationally fed animals, they don't produce all these other chemicals. And, we could get back to tracing the chemicals, you with your background. It's now estimated that we've created over 80,000 man-made chemicals. I've seen some estimates putting it at more like 140 or 150,000.
Way higher than that. We can go into that. I can give you the actual numbers. It's way higher.
It's way higher. And so I'm modest in the book, but 80,000 is a lot, especially when we don't study what they do individually, or moreover, in the soup that is created when you expose a young child in the womb, especially, or a woman's reproductive system, which is much more sensitive than men's, to these chemicals while they're developing. What are we doing to our children? Our daughters are menstruating 2 or 3 years younger on average than they used to. So it's like, if I'm not going to fight against this to the death, I might as well just get in my coffin and just start rotting now. And that doesn't matter if you're right or left wing. It doesn't matter what race you are or what wealth you are. If you have $10 billion in the bank and there's a cyber attack, we're told by the WEF that there's a cyber attack coming, Josh. Well, what would that do to the food supply? What would a fiat currency collapse do in this profligate, runaway, pork spending thing we're in? And so that distributism that Chris Smaje and I, Chris Smaje, the communist, and I agree on distributism. Chris is coming around, by the way. I just talked to him recently, and it may not be for public consumption, but I think he's starting to reevaluate some of the airy-fairy ideas of the big will fix the all. Wendell Berry's furious about this. You don't feed the world through large corporate America. You feed the world through the local peasantry. You don't solve the world's environmental problems by delegating it to a large mega corporation. Your decisions every day individually are what pollute the planet. Don't mow your lawn every 2 days. Get some sheep. They will mow the lawn for you. No fossil fuels, save you money. And if it was $100 a gallon for gas, you might evaluate how big your lawn was. And you mentioned something else, which is Europe versus the US. There's the contrast between Chris and me on our political outlook, but we're still allies on farming. And he's quite right that we have a unique opportunity in America because we still do have extant, intact areas of local agriculture that we can preserve, nurture, and learn from. We're losing the knowledge at our peril that only farmers have. You don't reclaim it easily, and it's not in a textbook, and you can't learn it in a university. Europe and England are way ahead of us on allowing the technocrats to take control. And now you've seen in Ireland, they're talking about banning cows. Ireland, which is a lot of regenerative and grass-fed farming. And so in the end, there are two main things we can do. Let's eliminate the massive subsidies to corn, ethanol, and other GMO crops. And the other is let's reduce the regulatory burdens on local farms, because the very entities that Wendell Berry has shown us that have destroyed agriculture in the small farm are the ones who are now claiming through the WEF, and I have articles out on this, but you can see it on their site. They're claiming that only GMOs can save the planet because GMOs are going to be more efficient. They're claiming that only fake meat and insect and soy-based meats can save the planet because cows are so bad. Let's trace the chemicals from the cow fart to the cow manure that rebuilds soils and replaces synthetic fertilizers, which urea is made out of natural gas, which is methane. Okay, so you want to get rid of the cows so you can have a factory-made fertilizer that doesn't replenish soils or rebuild them physically like cow manure does. If they could patent cow crap, they would, but then they can't because it requires that raw material. And then these chemicals are killing the microbiome and causing more death to soil and more loss of our health. And so the very same people, when they feel threatened, start to run to tell you why no, our technomysticism will solve these problems. We have fake meat for you. We have the patents. We have GMO crops that are spilling into all of your heirloom varieties and destroying them. We have a battle going on with Mexico, who doesn't want our crappy corn, and it's destroyed their economy. And that's why the farmers are growing heroin and marijuana, because of NAFTA under Bill Clinton. How could Democrats do any harm? The whole thing is this mantra of we are going to save you, but actually they're more terrified that we're waking up to their destruction. And just like mortgage derivatives, they're making a lot of money recklessly. And so now they want to double down, and they want to compel us to be dependent on toxic foods and more technology to save us. All we need is to get back to the garden, to paraphrase.
Good. Perfect. Yeah, perfect. So the stuff you ran through, that was excellent. And that's like the doomer optimism crowd. Like, we're at that point, people are at that point. They get how these intersecting problems occur, and the conversation of DO is like, okay, what are responses to that? And the super wide ranging, super heterodox. There's people that are all into Bitcoin and all this kind of stuff, and there's anything and everything you can imagine. It's very cool. It's very heterodox. There's no sort of dogma about it, right? This is a question that I want to ask you, because you've gone through this procedure. You're about 25 years into this small farming adventure that you and your wife have done. Right. And one of the last chapters of your book is about how the youth are the future. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you want people to jump. If people feel like they're ready to jump out of their professional managerial class, white collar, urban thing, and do this kind of thing, you want them to jump. The food crisis is coming. We need all hands on deck. We need more people recruited into this movement. But there are very practical considerations of how does a person actually do that. You have your particular backstory of how you transition into this and how you support it. Like you said, whatever you bought for $115,000, you got 160 acres with buildings and all this kind of stuff. Like, that's a total unicorn today, right? You're not going to find that kind of thing today. in our case, like my wife and I both have professional degrees. I have a PhD in engineering. She's got a doctorate in veterinary medicine. And the way that we've worked in our relationship is, like while she was going through her veterinary training, I was, getting money through research grants and through my job at the university and supporting us that way. And then as she moves into her veterinary practice, it frees me up to start to lay the groundwork for all our small farming thing, right? But if people come to me and say, Josh, how do I get started? How do I get into this? I can't say, well, first, marry a veterinarian who makes a good income, and can kind of bankroll a little bit while you start to build capacity. But it's one technique, right? It's a partnership and it's one technique. The question is, people are going to be coming from all sorts of different perspectives. What are models that you have seen to work from your own experience or people you know of, where you have somebody, maybe they're fresh out of college, maybe they're dealing with student debt, maybe they've got a degree in something that's interesting, but is not necessarily providing them a ton of practical skills for making hay or dealing with a tractor or growing radishes or whatever they're trying to do. What are ways that people break into this, and in a very practical level, economically, because we're swimming upstream here. Like there's not a nice recipe for this. This is not a career track where the road has been paved and made nice and smooth for people to do it. How have you seen people successfully migrate onto this road?
So action follows thought, and thought follows vision or a dream. And I'm glad you mentioned the book about youth. One thing I would strongly emphasize is that it was probably the best thing we ever did for our 3 young children to raise them on a farm. We didn't do it purposefully, but I would again if I would do it now purposefully. We say, oh, isn't farm? And by the way, everybody wants to hire our kids because once you grow up on a farm, you're ready for life. You're ready to work for free, overtime, 7 days a week, and then somebody gives you money for it. You go, really? And by the way, you upstaged me. I married an RN. That's pretty handy to have around too for farming, but a vet probably would have been better. But she can't hear me, and that's why I say that. So
It's the
we
sugar mama model. It's an established model. It's called the sugar mama model.
okay.
And when this podcast comes out, I'm gonna clip that segment where you talked about raising your kids on the farm and how they're ready for life. Because
Yes.
we have a 7-month-old. And I'm gonna clip that and I'm gonna play it for my wife and be like, see?
Yeah. No, it's I think it was Robert Heinlein, strange person to quote from a science fiction writer, who said that do not we have to stop handicapping our children by protecting them from adversity. I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's pretty close. We are raising the most pampered, clueless generation in the history of humanity. 30% of them, according to actual polls of high school graduates, don't know how to boil an egg. And I've seen it worse. You may have heard 10% of people think that chocolate milk comes from a brown cow. Things many of us take for granted, having lived in a rural environment. I've lived in the city as well. You can't take for granted anymore, and that's part of why I do this. I have kids out to visit the farm all the time. They just don't. There are fewer and fewer of them, and we again do so at our peril. So in answer to your question, people need to find their health issues, their knowledge issues, their financial issues, because everybody's different. And if you're going to make the leap, you could do it in different ways. Let me suggest that since COVID, the price of farmland in Vermont has more than doubled. The people have moved here en masse, many of them buying second homes. But many of those people are young people and they want to farm. And, when we're putting land, by the way, into rewilding, by giving people credits to grow trees, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. It takes a long time to create good farmland, to take, farmland that's taken out, for instance, here in Vermont from dairy, and then to pay people who are hedge funds or out of staters to get tax credits, and breaks on their real estate taxes to let the trees grow back. It's taking good farmland out. And as Joel Salatin and others, people smarter than me, point out, you sequester more carbon in grasslands than trees anyway. So why not do that? Plus, you
Why not do
food.
silvopasture, right? Like we raise our pigs in the woods.
Yes.
And so Joel, silvopasture. You can have both.
And, yes. Which you can do with some animals, which, by the way, it's a lot hard. You can't put pigs and chickens back to the land to the same degree you can cows because they're grain dependent. I don't know, you can find some substitutes, but boy, the first thing you want to get rid of is grain, and you can't do that with chickens. And their manure waste is much more toxic and kills lots of fish in rivers and kills humans. In the pig farms, when you get too close, it's sulfuric, whatever, it's horrible stuff. You know all the chemicals. Cows don't do that. I like the smell of cow poop. myself, if it's not in a concentrated facility. By the way, the cows, instead of using tractors to hide it or collect it in lagoons and then spread it, you just let the cows spread it. They walk around and they spread it using grass that they eat, which grass are solar panels. Okay, that's what grass is, God's solar panels. Now, they're not made in China. They're not made with coal and quartz. They're not made with chemicals or excavation of the ground. It really is. It's current energy. There's no more efficient solar panel collection system yet than grass. Okay, so you want to take them off of grass in the name of saving the trees. Where is the Lorax, by the way? Where is the Lorax in this conversation? So back to the kids thing, because I just want to emphasize that you have people fleeing, and then they come here and they want to start a business. And how do they do so when land prices are so high? So one of the things I've discussed here in Vermont when I ran for governor, but also is then incorporated in the book is, well, do we give tax credits to people? Do we give grants to people? Let's have the conversation. Do they have to have some qualifications to farm? Some young people are trust fund babies, or they have an inheritance, or maybe they're making a lot of money working in tech somewhere, and they're not happy, and they might be able to step out and have $500,000. Well, we don't want them to squander it. It takes Joel Salatin, You Too Can Farm, I think is his book. Says it takes about 5 years to get up to speed. I think I mentioned it. Great resources there with Joel's books. He has another book coming out, his 16th book. It's coming out in September. It's about this movement and homesteaders moving back to the land. In the oil crisis in the 70s, a lot of people, I remember it, moved back to the land. As soon as the price of fuel went back down again, they moved back to their convenience. This is going to be more sustained. And so what I want people to understand is that you need to jump, because you will, if you look at all the problems, you won't jump. Your vision will be killed. But if you jump, you will almost certainly find the way. And then you'll look back and say, I was so glad I jumped. But we want to help people jump. So if we have tax incentives and we help people and we pare back the regulations, under COVID, a lot of people in Vermont started trying to raise chickens and pigs for themselves. I know the grain dealers for organic grain, where we get our little bit of grain we use for our sheep, and their sales more than doubled. And then the fall came and there was no place to process them. And a lot of people suddenly found themselves with a lot, especially pigs, hundreds, thousands of pigs, no place to process them. Gee, it's almost like we don't have enough processing facilities. COVID exposed to us many of the vulnerabilities. It was just a birth pang, compared to the delivery that's coming, because sooner or later, this miraculous food system is going to be punctured. And once that happens, there is going to be absolute panic, because it could happen in one area, of food. It could happen in one area of the country or the world, but it's all the same thing. And once it starts, and if you lose your currency because you've recklessly, profligately overspent, all right, on pork projects and not for pork, all right, then you do so at your peril, because you can cause hyperinflation. And that's where's the debate in our food, in our carbon, in our climate discussion about what I call in the book and elsewhere, a hierarchy of uses. If I were to pollute and generate, let's say, a ton of carbon for the atmosphere, or half a ton of methane, but I did so to produce food, is that not a more viable and justifiable expenditure of environmental contamination than flying to Aruba for the weekend, or going with Epstein on the Lolita, or going on a ski trip? Isn't growing food by farmers more legitimate 100% of the time than somebody driving up to Vermont to go skiing,
right,
and using
with
artificially made snow?
I blame economists for this, right? Because the dollar that you spend to go on a ski trip in Colorado is equivalent to the dollar that's spent to grow food for somebody. And we all know in the moral economy that makes no sense. But but otherwise, regarding, like you're saying, there's no sort of hierarchy of values applied to this. It's just like, if you can afford to spend the money, then it's not illegal, then technically that there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, and that brings us back. Well, let me answer your question just a little bit more. I want to be responsive, but I think it's important for your viewers and listeners to hear it. And hopefully you'll have me on again, because we're having so much fun, and I'll bring a calf next time. But there's also a group of people that are moving out of the city that don't want to farm, but they want to live in Vermont. They make a lot of money on their laptop. There's a whole new, look at the commercial real estate collapses, because there's been a huge transition of people moving back out of the cities and into the country for very good reasons. They like clean air, they like clean water, they like to go for walks with their dogs. They might not like crime so much. They may realize that the hospitals get a little crowded, with disease and all of it. But they're moving here to Vermont, and They're making 150 grand a year on their laptop and they work 60 hours a week for some company in California or Taiwan, right? But guess what they want to buy? They want to buy that local, fresh, reliable food where the animal was humanely treated, where they might even know the animal and that the animal was slaughtered on the grass it was born on, like it used to be done for tens of thousands of years. And they want to buy that from somebody local. So those two groups of young people serve one another, just like rural farmers serve urban diners. Okay. I want to go to a concert once in a while, maybe I haven't in a while, or to an opera, haven't in a while, or maybe some other, event or museum. And those things are in the cities and those things appeal to me. And that's how we trade goods. But the real energy movement is moving from the country into the cities. This is what Wendell Berry talks about. And he calls globalization the greatest weapon of mass destruction ever created by man. So what is the opposite of globalization? Localization, distributism, the Jeffersonian ideal and the Chestertonian idea. G.K.
Okay,
Chesterton said,
clarify this. This is a good point. Clarify this for me. So yeah, you noted this trend of you have like laptop class people moving to the country, right?
mm-hmm.
And they bring their money and they want to buy nice grass-fed beef or lamb or whatever. So are you saying that this can serve as a kind of a bootstrap model for new producers coming in to try to find a market to kind of bootstrap things? Because I would think that like long run, you don't really want to create this kind of feudal situation in the rural areas where you have this overclass of like highly remunerated laptop people and a sort of underclass of the rednecks that do all the grunt work. Even though
that's what we already have. That's what we have here.
We have it. We have, and we don't want that. I mean, no. The secret between you and me is this farming grunt work is awesome. It's fun. And, it played a big role. You mentioned at the beginning of our talk that you had Lyme disease and fibromyalgia, and you had to find yourself in a living situation with regular physical activity as part of a therapeutic approach to dealing with that,
Yes.
And I'm in the same way where I worked full-time for a few years as a faculty member at a big research university and was on my laptop like 16 hours a day writing research proposals to National Science Foundation. And I was just like, I'm going to go insane if I can't get out and spend my physical energy and work with my hands and stuff. And so that was part of my transition. So there's that quality of life aspect and the need for physicality. But so if we're looking at in the sort of short and medium term, we bootstrap, there's like this sort of rural gentrification going on, but it's bringing money and it's bringing consumers for, healthfully and ecologically produced foodstuffs. Okay, so then what? And then we kind of slowly like brainwash these laptop class people away from their professional managerial class jobs and recruit them into our vision of creating these decentralized agrarian communities, or what? Like what's the game the rest of that plan out for me?
They're already here. And as we said earlier, a lot of times the more academically advanced they are, the more specialized they are in knowledge and the more useless they become. That's a paraphrase of Wendell Berry. Some people are going to work 16 hours a day on a laptop in a high-rise 16th floor cubicle like I used to, and we need them to do that work. I want to live in the country now. I did my stint in the, my tour of duty in the cubicle, but we still need people to do that. And they're still humans and some of them like it, and we still want to eat healthy food. Right. Mm-hmm. So, and what I mentioned before is that people are waking up and they're moving towards something. Well, let's show them where they're moving and that it's safe. Let me make a parallel with you with Wendell Berry. When I met with Wendell a couple of years ago, we had started engaging years ago, in part because of my battle here in Vermont over on-farm slaughter, but for other reasons as well. He's a wonderful person. So we finally went to meet with him. And I said to Wendell, well, this is what my book is about. I was trying to explain to him that conservatives could support the environment. He was like, really? I was like, yeah, there are a lot of us, actually. Give us some credit, I said, Wendell, my book is kind of like the old country song about what you get or the old joke about what you get when you play a country song backwards. Have you heard that? And he said, no, I don't think I have, Mr. Klar. He's a great guy. So I said, well, what do you get when you play a country song backwards? He said, well, I don't know. I said, well, you get your car back, you get your job back, you get your wife back, you get your dog back. And he laughed at that. I said, what do you get when you play Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America backwards? Well, you get your healthy food back, you get your cows back, you get your grain dealer back, you get your equipment dealer back, you get your school back, you get your local public library reopened, people, Vermont is sitting here waiting to receive these people. Our schools have lost 30% of our students in the last 25 years. We've closed a bunch of schools. But what's happened more broadly, tying this back to economics? If we look at the history of Vermont, which was always far removed from the urban centers where it sold its food, where it depended on urban centers like Boston to sell its food. The wool market collapsed around 1850. So the tens of thousands of sheep that coated Vermont's mostly deforested hills were suddenly not so valuable. So we shifted to dairy. And at first we sold mostly butter and cheese that could be shipped long distances in, wagons to Boston. And then the railroads and things opened up. So we started shipping raw milk, and the dairy industry exploded. Vermont had about 27 or 28,000 dairy farms in 1929, when the price of milk then dropped by half. But then what happened? Around 1890, Vermont started being destroyed in its dairy industry. It's that long ago because of railroads opening up places like Ohio, which have a kinder climate, flatter land, fewer rocks, shorter winter. I put up feed for 210 days of the winter, if you can imagine that. And we were actually more like 220 this year. We're more than half the year. That's a lot of feed to put up mechanically or, with loose hay. So then what happened? So Vermont, for decades now, after we've been artificially destroyed in our farms, as Wendell documents, through academics coupled with, at universities with government authorities who said, oh no, get bigger, get out, right? You butts again. Or, you need this tractor for $350,000. Let's face it, the farmers nationally, even the big ones, they're not making the money. The profits go to the ones who produce the chemicals and the applications and the GMOs and the seed. We're just the conduits. We're really sort of enslaved. You could be farming 2,000 acres at a loss and you're losing your capital, but they don't lose money at corporate profits in the big boardrooms. So what have we done? Now Vermont's shifting to say, well, let's just have everybody work for the government. Our largest employer in the state is the state of Vermont. They literally believe when they create more bureaucrat jobs that this going to trickle down the economy, forgetting that it's like a dragon eating its tail because somebody has to pay these people. And they're always siphoning it off as a huge loss of efficiency. And so Vermont's become more and more of a tourist place where people are building art shops and little getaways. Well, guess what? Food counts. We're mostly forested. We have about 560 dairy farms that are mostly largely concentrated. And if the manure hit the fan again, instead of broadly distributed small farms, we now have way more people in our country and way fewer farms further away with lost knowledge of how to operate without cheap fuel. So this is a tidal wave of a shift, of an economic reversal, of cheap energy and a technological boom that has failed and is not sustainable. Industrial agriculture is in its death throes and it's thrashing around through the WEF, which just look at the list of the horrible names in industry that populate the fellows at the WEF. DuPont, Dow, Syngenta, JBS, Tyson Foods, Bayer, which it used to be Monsanto, is now Bayer because they thought they put like the little baby picture on it. They're still the same corporate thugs they always were. They don't care about human health. They don't care about the farmers. They want to get rid of the farmers. Farmers are a threat to globalists because farmers are independent. We're not dependent on you. We're the anti-federalists. Okay, we don't trust the government. You want to trust the government in corporate America? You have a good time. I'm very sorry for your children and grandchildren, but for me and my house, we will have a cow and a lamb, and we will try to have more and nurture others who do so because collectively, we then have a community again. We regrow the communities that we've destroyed in a short-term blip of folly built on technomysticism and cheap oil. It's time to and we either do that rapidly or we do that slowly, right? And I propose that we do it. If you do it rapidly, I mean, you've had a collapse overnight and you find out that, all your cows are in another part of the country and you're going to starve, start boiling your shoe leather. But we do it slowly. We do it now. And people are waking up, and they're waking up across political lines. And I would just add a little parallel. I've recently seen Robert F. Kennedy Jr. speak twice. Once in New Hampshire, he spoke about vaccines. Once here in Vermont at a platform hosted by libertarians, he spoke about climate. What intrigued me was two different subjects, but in both cases, I watched Americans from the left and the right be united in hope. the way they were under Obama, but maybe with a little more legitimacy, because Obama clearly was a fraud. He proved himself to be that. I'm sorry. I voted for him. He betrayed me. He betrayed the farmers. So, you lied. I wanted to give you a chance. I'd like to give this guy a chance. But aside from him, what I saw and rejoiced in was liberals and conservatives coming together and uniting over something important to them, whether it's vaccines, right? Who cares whether you're right wing or left wing if you realize that you shouldn't give a 5-year-old an experimental vaccine that they don't need, right? So, and maybe I'm getting political there. I don't know. I think it's science. And people are uniting on the food thing. And I just came back from Polyface Farm just 2 days ago, and I saw the same thing. And just as I've described, it's booming. All right. Join the party, folks. Get on board. You want to be on the ground floor, right? You don't want to be the last one to exit the city. If you jump and you find the means, back to your question, and you find what you have for family support, and you get some government support, and you recognize that it's a transition, and you do your research and you find your niche, I would say that value added typically is better. If you can can some vegetables, if you can process your meats into smoked sausages or something. But when it comes to meats and grass-fed meats are already value added. They take longer to produce. The demand is there. So what are people waiting for? If you want a business plan, if you want to get out of that cubicle, if you want, and with all of its adversity and no days off, and if you're ready to do that, come in, the water's fine.
Right.
It's an awesome way to live.
Okay. And so do you think you think that farmers market retail, do you think like trying to selling local restaurants, or do you see, well, what were your observations? So you're just at Polyface, they had some activities and stuff going on there. What were some of your observations there, and what do you what do you see as far as people like trying to make it work economically? What are the hot zones for that? Right,
all of the above. I mean, throughout history, people who are entrepreneurial find a need and meet it. Whether it's inventing the ballpoint pen, or so you have to. There's a phrase in the law that you take your victim as you find them. It's called the eggshell skull rule. And if I tap you in the head and your skull caves in, I mean, that's too bad. That's my fault. Take your community as you find it, because there's no one size fits all. So in Vermont, it depends even on where you are. So one of the things we're trying to do in Vermont also for farmers is improve not just processing, but marketing and distribution systems. We only have a state of about 640,000 people here in our whole state. So go to the area you're going to and ask yourself, don't say, oh yeah, I'm gonna grow peanuts, and you're in Michigan or something. You have to look at what are the available resources, what is your land size, what will your soil support, and what is your market, and what do people want? Who else is already serving that market? By the way, I have a chapter in the book about this. Something else that I propose to do, which is a little controversial. First of all, moving to phase out monoculture subsidies makes me a wanted man by corporate America. I'll probably get killed. That'll be why, and that's a good way to go out. I don't propose we do it overnight, because we'd be like Sri Lanka. We are, as a nation, dependent on industrial food. We shouldn't precipitously end that. It wouldn't be fair to the farmers, and it would hurt everything. But we can phase out with incentives without any kind of draconian moves. Now, what I propose to do is use the savings from those subsidies to subsidize young people, or farmer, but mostly it's young people. Let's face it, when you're 70, you're not looking to get into farming. Let's subsidize people based on production who actually create food, which is healthy, instead of subsidizing high fructose corn syrup and hydrogenated fats and things that then have additional externalized healthcare costs. Let's do the opposite. And let's subsidize that over a short 5-year period, where we might have money for grants. In my proposal here in Vermont, I proposed, and so this is just the discussion here. I'm a tax attorney, so I think we just have to talk. I proposed a 50 cents on the dollar tax credit for a farmer for the first, let's say, 3 years of production. Now, if you're raising a beef that normally you might break even on or only make $100, this is not based on net profits. This credit is based on gross sales. So you'd have an incentive to jump in, because you're going to make money, right, based on your actual sales to a customer. So you still have to have a market, but you're guaranteed. It's just basically bumped up your profit margin for those early years. And Joel Salatin and I, we've had words about this, because he's a libertarian. He says, no, we shouldn't have government subsidies for anything. Well, I paint it as more like reparations. I hate to use that word, but reparations don't have to be for race only. They can be for, Japanese intern camp. They can be for a lot of things. It's like any recovery in law. We should be giving reparations to the small farmers whose families and heritage has been destroyed by a corrupt corporatocracy for decades. How can we just say, okay, we're going to eliminate the corporatocracy, go on your own? You can't revitalize what you've lost that quickly. This is where Chris Smaje and I again agree.
Let me comment on this real quick because there's a strong theoretical and empirical basis for this. And what it brings to mind is, have you read the economist Ha-Joon Chang? Is that name
No.
familiar? So he's got a few good books, like it's something like 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism or something like that. But what he describes is the process by which the rich countries of the world develop themselves, like the United States, as an example, the UK, through economic protectionism. Like economic protectionism is like this dirty word, right? But the way the US developed was to protect native industries with tariffs and all this kind of stuff, all the stuff that's heresy now. And then when the United States became strong, then it was like, okay, now we're going to compete on the global stage. And then from the perspective of like the so-called developing world, they're having this free market fundamentalism and neoliberalism imposed on them. And when they say, well, we want to protect our native industries, we want to nationalize, we want to put tariffs, they get hammered by the WTO, right? And so it's basically like the rich countries are saying, we want you to develop, but you can't use the tools that we used. We're going to put you in this dog eat dog free, quote unquote, free market competition kind of thing. And so what it sounds like you're describing is a version of that. It's saying like, let's do economic protectionism of new producers so that they can get their feet under them and get them strong enough for the first few years before we make them go right into the teeth of the market as it stands. So, and you proposed something along these lines. It sounds like in Vermont. Did it pass? What was the basis of the resistance to it if it didn't pass or if it's not being implemented? Is
Yeah.
it corporations are just fighting back against this, or like what's the resistance?
Well, in interviewing Joel Salatin the other day about his recent testimony in U.S. Congress, I think it mirrors that over the battle of the Prime Act. Why have we not passed the Prime Act, which allows states to have more freedom for intra-state commerce of meat sales? It would be a tremendous boon. It's been introduced for about 5 or more years now by Thomas Massie. It's stalled and going to get killed again. And right now it's directly on partisan lines. The Democrats are saying, oh, no, 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 we have to have the government inspect all your food. It's interesting that the Republicans have really become the party of the lower class, of the working class. Whether Democrats are aware of that yet or not, they might want to read Thomas Frank and they might want to look at the statistics. Soros and Gates and the others aren't Republicans. It's an interesting transition, but again, it doesn't matter. And you remind me of the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You may have been familiar with that. How we switched from a colonial effort where instead of invading a country and stealing its resources, we would just sell them a package of goods they don't need that we sell them, kind of like Iraq War, and loan them the money to buy all our stuff at high rates. And now we own them; they can't repay it because we've sold them a lot more than they can afford. And now we extract all their natural resources while they cut down their mahogany to pay off their debt to the World Trade Organization. And it seems to me that we've just turned those eyes onto Americans now, and we're doing the same thing to our country. We're plunging us into debt, which then our grandchildren are going to have to pay off. Here in Vermont, my farming manifesto, which is still out there somewhere, it was a 14-pager, and it outlined how we could support farmers with a combination of property and income tax benefits. But that doesn't, America's a patchwork. Vermont has extremely high real estate taxes. So you may not need that in West Virginia or other places, but a blended idea of property and income supports for a transitional period to help people get back on their footing in a free market, which this has not been, in a free market. And with the pressures that I'm talking about, with more farmers coming into the field, more competitiveness, it'll bring down the price of healthy food. If we stop subsidizing toxic high fructose corn syrup foods, then we don't have to put a sugar tax on. You see what's happened? We've subsidized the crappy foods that inner city people eat. Now we're going to tax them on it to make them not eat it. Why don't we just eliminate both? And something I just want to emphasize, capitalism is not the enemy of people. It's corrupt capitalism is. Socialism has a pretty strong record of communist countries of how they've used food to starve people, Mao and Stalin and others. It doesn't matter. And, Schumacher talks about this and others. It's about distributism again. It's about keeping it local, because any so-called political system has the capacity to be corrupted. And the bigger it is, the more likely it is to fail. And so
when you're mentioning, I'm totally ignorant of this side of things, so I'm going to ask the really really basic question. When you're talking about these kind of reforms or policies that could be put in place regarding property taxes or subsidizing small farmers for healthy food, is that something that you see better enacted at really at a small level, like the county level or state level, or is this something where there's like big machinery at the federal level that we need Thomas Massey to go in there and just take down the major barrier to all this, or is this something that localities can begin to implement even as regardless of what's going on at the federal level?
Good question. We need both.
Okay.
States can do a lot. Maine last year passed the first in the nation constitutional amendment, Article 25, I think it was, um, declaring a right to buy food directly from consumers. The battle with Amos Miller and the whole raw milk battle, we've kind of won that. Something like 35 states now, I understand, are allowing us to have raw milk. We can win battles. We won the battle in Vermont, over on-farm slaughter. I can sell quarters of beef now, whereas 5 years ago they were trying to ban all on-farm slaughter. I'm talking specifically about on-farm slaughter, and many states do not allow that. I recommend the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. They actually have a link there with a map, and it'll show you your state. But there are some major problems at the federal level that need to be addressed as well. States can try to fight back, but they're fighting a massive federal, if not international, juggernaut. And so there are policies at play that are not just the subsidies for monocultures, but what about the farm bill? What about that something like 70% of the farm bill now goes to food under the SNAP program? And it was designed to buy excess agricultural products and supply it to people in need. And now it's become more of a welfare program. Well, what are we supplying them with? Highly processed foods. Where there are profits, corporations are drawn. If they see money in organics, they're going to try to compromise that label so they can sell you crap and still put organics on it. They're about as trustworthy as a cigarette company. All right, literally. They're not any more trustworthy. They've proved it. They're about as trustworthy as a pharmaceutical company. That's your food companies. So
I will say at the farmers market where we sell our pork and lamb, there's different ways you can purchase stuff. One way is with tokens, and people can actually use their SNAP or EBT to get tokens, and I think they get double what the thing
yeah,
is. Because obviously the farmers market food is more expensive than the cheap processed nasty stuff.
yeah.
So anyway, encouraging like little incentive to help people to buy healthy food that way.
Well, and Vermont has a similar program, and that's something the state can do under the federal programs. There's a lot of fraud there too, by the way, with the EBT cards here in Vermont. You can take cash advances and go out and buy alcohol and dog food. So there are a lot of, again, the bigger it gets, the more problems it gets. Mm-hmm. And I don't necessarily have all the solutions to that, but what I'm saying is the federal regulations that impinge the ability of us to freely grow food and sell it in a true free market locally do impact our intra-state activities. And that's where the Prime Act is a perfect example. The Prime Act would help clear up the obfuscation about what exactly is federal versus state processing turf, right? And it would allow it, because people don't want to build a $3 million facility if it's not going to square with the USDA, all right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As far as, for a custom processing facility, let's say. Why have we not passed the Prime Act? Americans should be up in arms about this. Most Americans have no idea what it is, no idea how it impacts them. So, education and forums like this one are the beginning of a growing revolution. The true revolution is to rebel against the totalitarianism of our federal government, I don't care which party, and the WEF. And that means becoming self-reliant. We won the American Revolution in large part because we had a strong foundation of food supplies, okay? And it was even fought in part over food, taxes on things like sugar and tea. Food is the foundation. But here's the illusion. We in America have reduced, until recently, the average cost for Americans of our food down to about 9% of our budget, which is probably the cheapest and most wonderful gift of any society in history, except it means that we take it for granted, we cheapen it, we throw it away, we let animals rot in our fridge and in our landfills because we don't have the reverence we should have for them. So maybe we should pay $20 a gallon for milk. And that's coming. It's just a matter of when. That's called inflation. And how bad will it be? Well, that's a monetary issue. And if you're raising your own food, that's one way to stay right out of the cycle of a fiat currency, because you don't have to translate it into that. You just grow your tomato and you eat it. So I do believe that it needs to be blended. And that's why I'm actually, excited to try to use Vermont as the foundation to speak to the rest of the country. Look, we're farmers here, And most of you have paved over your land or turned it into suburbia. You've let your trees grow. Where is your farming? How do you reclaim it once you pave it, once you spray it,
Mhm.
with lawn fertilizers? Do you even want to grow vegetables there again? Let's preserve what we can, and let's work together with humility, and state and federal level. Absolutely. Again, people can't be led to believe there's no hope, because that is exactly why we become paralyzed. There is hope, and people are getting on the move, and they're going to feed their kids and their grandkids. And we're Americans, and we've done this before. And so this is what you and I and Joel Salatin and Wendell Berry and many other people are trying to lead as a movement. It's a back to the land movement, but a permanent one. It's a permaculture.
There you go. There you go. Cool, man. Well, listen, you've given us a ton of your time today. Your book, A Small Farm Republic, is awesome. I definitely recommend people check it out. Go ahead, hold
Hi,
on.
Lamb.
Yes,
Yeah.
hi, Lim. I have one comment that I just kind of want to make just to wrap on at the very end to kind of tie it up. But before I do that, do you have any final things that we didn't get to, or other things you want to mention, or things you want to point people towards before we wrap on a final comment?
Well, that's kind of you. My Substack is called Small Farm Republic. I'm really excited to be able to write there about a lot of other ancillary issues that I couldn't fit in the book, and current events that arise. And I stray, as you saw, into areas of other areas at times. And I hope people. I didn't write this book to get rich. I wrote this book because I don't want to watch people starve. I don't want to watch people. I don't care what your politics. I don't care your sexual range. I don't care about any of that. I don't want to see a single person sickened or starving in America or anywhere else because of something that could have been prevented with a little common sense. This book equips people so that they can learn in more depth everything we've talked about, so that they can counter with other people say, oh, grass-fed is wrong and organics is wrong, and we can only feed the world with industrial agriculture. These are lies
Right.
spread by liars. And so this book is more important than me or my lamb or you. And so I hope that people will buy it, read it, and then comment on it and share it and tell me where I'm wrong, and let's have this conversation about finding solutions to some of perhaps the most intractable and profound problems in all of human history, which come down to food supply, period.
Awesome.
It's going to keep being about food. So go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off. I
No, that's
rambled.
beautiful, man. That's beautiful. Thank you for that. And I just wanted to mention at closing that my entry point into some of your writings and some of your work was on your Substack, where you wrote an impassioned paean to the old pickup truck and the virtues inherent in keeping old pickup trucks running and useful, and to resist the temptation to run out and buy the newest, latest, greatest, most high tech electric or whatever vehicle. And so I thought, man, this guy likes old pickup trucks. I myself am a lover of old Toyotas, and I have two old ones that I'm the caretaker for in this life. And so yeah, I felt like it's a man after my own heart, and I thought that was great. And if anybody, that's as good a place as any to start exploring your work.
Thank you.
Into old pickup trucks. So with that, I definitely want to have you on again. It's been a great discussion. So thanks for your time today. And again, John Klar, Small Farm Republic.
Josh, thank you. I've enjoyed it. I'm very grateful.